My talk today is on institutions, economic growth, and poverty. I'm delighted to kind of be able to talk about such a fascinating topic with you all this morning. And I thought we might start with a picture, okay, kind of ease our way into it here. So can everyone see this depiction? Okay, so have a look at it for just a moment here. This is a 15th century German manuscript. It's from what was called the Medieval House Book. And the Medieval House Book was basically a book that was trying to give a depiction of daily life as seen through the eyes of a knight. Okay, so seen through the eyes of a knight. Anyone want to kind of say something that they see in this picture? Or kind of describe some things?
A lot of suffering.
Okay, a lot of suffering, yes. What else?
There is agriculture, like agricultural business.
Okay.
Slavery.
Oh, they're buried here.
There's some guy who's in the stocks, sitting over here. What else?
There's some castle over there, at the top of the hill.
Okay, very interesting as to what's going on at the top of the hill.
There's a hangman.
Yes, that's right. There's a man being hanged. Anyone else see what's going on?
Where's
Huh? Okay, so we have a man that's being. Okay, so we have, some kind of poor conditions going on down here at the ground. We have a man in the stocks, as you pointed out. Okay, in the background, we have a man being hung, and we have a corpse kind of dangling there. We also have a guy that's actually been broken on a wheel up there. So here's the second drawing, and we can have a look here. Here, again, what do we see going on?
Stabbing.
Yes, in the lower left, we have a stabbing going on. A peasant's being stabbed by a soldier.
on the right side, someone is stealing something.
Yes, we have some theft going on over here.
Someone is trying to punch someone.
Yes, we have a peasant in fetters being kind of struck by another knight. Okay, and above them we have a group of horsemen that are attempting to set fire to the farmhouse as one of them drives off another farmer's cattle and strikes his wife. Okay, so we have a lot of things going on in these pictures, and what I want to kind of convey to you, again, this is from the Medieval House Book that was trying to give a depiction of what everyday life looked like for a knight in feudal Europe. And feudal Europe was populated by knights that today we would equate with something called warlords. Okay, states were ineffectual. The king was merely the most prominent of all of the noblemen, but he didn't have a permanent army usually, and he didn't have a lot of control over his country. Governance was outsourced to barons, knights, other noblemen, and there were fiefs of various different sizes. Knights routinely raided one another's territories in terms of conquest, in terms of preemptive attack, vengeance. And as the house book illustrates, they didn't restrict their killing to other knights. Basically, everything was kind of on the table. And the point of kind of looking back in terms of this picture in the background about what's going on, the man being hung at the gallows, the other one being broken on the wheel, these were kind of a backdrop to everyday life, okay? This was something that was in the background very often. Okay, so why do we do this? Well, there's a couple of different ways to get more stuff, okay? There's a couple of ways to get more stuff, and the first is we can make more stuff. But if any of you have any of you read an essay called I, Pencil? I, Pencil is a beautiful essay. I'll send it to Bob so he can circulate it around. But I, Pencil makes the case that, even something as simple as an everyday pencil is incredibly, incredibly difficult to make. So difficult, in fact, that if I gave you all of the resources, any one of you, all of the resources, you couldn't be able to make a pencil by yourself. Okay, so something as simple as that. Milton Friedman, yes, he utilized that essay as well. So we would use that to make that point, absolutely. So making stuff is one way to get more stuff, but that's hard. And you can also take it. And the world that we were just looking at in terms of the medieval handbook, the world that was being illustrated, even for people who rose to the ranks of knights, was very much a world of make or take. Okay? That's how you got more stuff. So world GDP in that world looked like this. Now, I don't know if you can see that, but that's a flat line. That is a flat line from the beginning of human history all the way up through medieval times. Even if you zoom in, okay? We might see a little bit of fluctuations around the trend. I can show you some pictures in terms of what England looked like right before the Black Plague and how that kind of changed their trajectory. But for all intents and purposes, GDP was pretty flat. Okay? That was what, for the vast majority of human history, we basically lived in a make-or-take world. Okay? And so there's a deceptively simple explanation for this empirical pattern. Okay? And I say deceptively simple because we're going to unpack it to actually make it more complicated. But anyone want to give me kind of an Occam's razor explanation for why this might be the case? A simple, kind of one-line explanation? Yeah.
No cooperation.
Okay, no cooperation. Anyone else?
Mobility, lack of mobility.
Okay, lack of mobility. You know, transportation costs were high. Transaction costs were high in this world. Okay, we're going to get to institutions in just a minute. Patriarchy. We can always condemn the patriarchy. I'm sorry?
Specialties.
Okay, so we're going to get there, right? So there's two ways to, you know, there's different ways to make get more stuff. We can make it, we can take it. But when we're in this make and take world, it's really a zero or a negative sum world, okay? If we make things, we can have them, and that is you know, useful to us. But it doesn't generate what we call increasing returns, okay? When we're either making and taking stuff, if we're making it just for consumption, we're not generating kind of a positive sum world. And if we're actually in a world where there's lots of rating and taking going on, that world can actually be a negative sum world, okay? What I make gets taken away from me, okay? And we end up worse off than we were to start, okay? So when we look at that empirical pattern of all of human history up until this, till certainly, you know, roughly in the mid-1600s, we're living in this make and take world. But it turns out there's another way in which we can get more stuff. And in fact, there's only 3 ways we can get more stuff, okay? We can trade. And trade, as we said, you know, is limited by the extent of the market. Okay, so trade is driven by the division of labor, and as Adam Smith tells us, the division of labor is going to be limited by the extent of the market. So we're going to care about how many people we can trade and interact with, because if we can interact and trade with more people, we can specialize. And if we can specialize, it means that we don't have to make everything that we consume, right? We can specialize and then exchange with one another according to our own abilities. You know, I'm terrible at making things and fixing cars, but I can give a lecture from time to time. And if there's enough people who want to hear me lecture from time to time, I don't have to worry about making my own clothes, fixing my own cars, or producing my own food. Okay, so the division of labor, specialization, exchange leads to a world in which we can actually engage in positive sum exchange. We can generate returns over and above what the inputs cost in order to kind of make those goods, right? So we can exchange and actually create more value than what we could if we are in a world in which we have to make and produce everything ourselves. And particularly in a world in which we have to make and produce everything ourselves and it can be taken and stolen from us. Okay, so all of human history up until roughly the mid-1600s, we have a flat GDP. Okay, but trade did expand. And it wasn't until we actually experienced the Industrial Revolution that we witnessed what we come to understand as the modern miracle of exponential economic growth. Okay, so can everyone see this line? Am I standing in front of it? If I stand over here? Okay. This is a modern miracle. Okay. This is what we want to understand and try to explain. Okay, the absolute exponential growth of world GDP that happens after the Industrial Revolution. Okay, now, economic historians have spent a lot of time trying to understand what caused and what are some of the factors that led to this exponential miracle of economic growth. One of Nobel Prize-winning economist Doug North made a lot of headway in this area by understanding that institutions play an important role in terms of both constraining political power such that it can release productive capacity of kind of people who are living underneath that political power, and also institutions that allow for capital accumulation, okay? Allow for people to actually save, invest those resources, and reap the rewards of those savings and investment over time. And so Doug North pointed out the importance of institutions for serving both of these functions, curbing and curtailing political power in such a way to allow for the creative, enterprising actions of the division of labor, specialization and exchange to take hold and allow for capital accumulation to develop. But he wasn't the only one who looked at this question. Okay, there's another economic historian named Joel Mokyr who points out, you know, institutions are important, but there's also an incredible important role for scientific discovery and ideas. Okay, so in Joel Mokyr's book, The Enlightened Economy, he shows that we cannot understand the Industrial Revolution without also recognizing the importance of the intellectual sea change that was brought about as a result of the Age of Enlightenment. Okay? The Enlightenment brought forward a whole different way of thinking about science and thinking about new ideas that led to rapid development and discovery. Okay? So Mokyr kind of discredits some of the standard explanations that focus strictly on geographical factors and wants to kind of point some attention to this role of scientific discovery and ideas. Okay? But then there's a third economic historian who has something to say about this issue, and this is Deirdre McCloskey. And what Deirdre points out in her trilogy, The Bourgeois Virtues, that there was also a cultural change that happened that preceded the Industrial Revolution. And this cultural change that shifted, beginning in Holland but spreading throughout, again with the Enlightenment, was a cultural shift of recognizing the dignity of commerce. Okay? Commerce went from being a sinful act, okay, in which exchanges were seen as something that was, you know, culturally unapproved of, to something that was actually acceptable and then onwards to be praiseworthy. Okay.
Yeah. Can it also be part of the Protestant movement expansion? The influential scholars who really gave a big place to commerce to success, to being successful in that?
Yes, absolutely. Some social scientists point to the Protestant, you know, the wave of Protestantism that kind of swept through. Some of, you know, Max Weber famously points to the Protestant work ethic. But Deirdre McCloskey's argument actually stretches back a little bit earlier. And she wants to say that it was actually a pretty widespread cultural shift. So one kind of data point that she might point to is that if you've ever read Shakespeare, and you read has anyone read The Merchant of Venice? Okay, well, if you haven't, you should. It's fantastic. But even as you know, even if you go back to Shakespeare, if you look through most of all of Shakespeare's writings, you don't find any kind of characters that are engaged in commerce but are also seen as virtuous. Okay, and that this actually is an important shift that comes about as a result of part of the Enlightenment virtues spreading. So economic historians, taken together, they all disagree about how much of these three factors played a role. Okay, everyone wants to kind of have their own theory, and I'm not going to be too concerned with that today, but I want to say that all three of them, I think, are incredibly important. Yeah.
So I have to, mentioning the Merchant of Venice, I have to ask the Jewish aspect of this, because Jews did work as merchants or as bankers weren't as popular, I think, even throughout these centuries. So how does this relate to the change in the role of, or the dignity of this trade?
So I think that's a good question. I don't know specifically how that relates, but I do know, and there's some very fascinating work that's been done on this. So I would point you to, both looking at Deirdre's work, but also some of the work of Timur Kuran, who's done a bit of work in understanding how kind of the cultural underpinnings of these things, particularly in the Arab world, shifted some of the kind of cultural predispositions towards recognizing commerce as not being something, sinful. So I would encourage you to dig more into that question because it's incredibly important. And there's also been some very interesting work by an economic historian named Mark Koyama, who's looked at kind of the role of religious persecution in determining kind of comparative advantages amongst various different groups. And so I don't have a full answer for you, particularly on that, but I can point you to those resources. So we don't know exactly how much each of these three contributed, but we do know that after, as the Industrial Revolution started to push forward, the world did start to experience some increases in income. Okay, so this is this is a GDP that's standardized to 1990 international comparisons, and it's just pointing out that the red area, the gray areas have no data. The red areas are very, very poor, and we start to see a little bit of increase in GDP around 1820. But the first thing to point out is that it's very difficult to compare income or consumption levels over long periods of time because the available goods and services tend to change very significantly. Don Boudreau and I were talking about this yesterday on the way over to the winery, just how difficult it is to make comparisons about the quality and types of goods that are available, even over short periods of time. But it's worth pointing out that this comparison is important because I don't think it would be incorrect to claim that even people who were the richest people in the world around 1836 were in some sense quite poor and impoverished by our standards. So to give an example, this is a picture of a very wealthy Jewish German banker named Nathan Rothschild, who arguably was the richest man in the world when he died in 1836. And he died in 1836 from an infected abscess, okay? It was something that today could be treated with basic antibiotics, okay? Basic antibiotics would have cured the richest man in the world, but he didn't have access to those antibiotics at the time, okay? So today, only the very poorest people in the world would die from the same cause of death that the richest man in the world in 1836 died from. Okay? Today, those antibiotics would run, pennies on the dollar. So after 1870s, we start to get some more growth. More countries industrialized. We get increases in the productivity of work. Their economies start to grow, and poverty starts to decline. Excuse me. So by 1950, so this is the decline in global poverty. So this is measuring poverty using an extreme poverty measure. Okay. So World Bank data standardized for historical reasons puts this on par with less than $1 a day. And so by 1950, we have a sharp decline in the number of people living in extreme poverty, but it's not complete. Okay? So as we continue to go forward in time and get closer to today, we see that the world is vastly richer than ever before, and countries all over the world, in various different parts of the world, had started to grow. Okay, so when we kind of unpack our picture here, we start to see a lot of different growth across the world and variation in how much growth. And if we want to try to make these comparisons about how much our standard of living has increased over time, again, it's very hard to make these types of comparisons when so much is changing in terms of how we kind of, in the quality and the types of goods that we're looking at. So this is a graph here that tries to explain how many hours of light, so equivalent to burning one modern light bulb, that 60 hours of labor would get you throughout history. Okay, so this is an attempt to standardize the comparison by comparing it to hours of labor that it would take in order to light a light bulb. Okay, so today the same amount of labor. So in hunter-gatherer times, when we had to use an open fire, you'd have to gather, chop, and burn wood for roughly 10 hours a day. So 10 hours a day of labor for 6 days straight in order to produce the equivalent of a modern light bulb for 1 hour. Okay? So today, the same amount of labor could light a room for over 50 years. That's the comparison. That's what that spike of modern economic growth is trying to kind of convey. So these figures come from a very fascinating paper by an economist named William Nordhaus. And he was trying to do just this. He was trying to kind of measure and compare standards of living across radical different times. And this was also a kind of a standard exercise that Adam Smith was engaged in when he was trying to understand how do we understand improvements in our well-being that come about as the result of economic growth. Okay. So when we look at poverty comparisons today, I'm going to draw a lot of data from the World Bank, and the World Bank has a wealth of information on both global poverty and extreme poverty. And when we look at the extreme poverty line, we want to kind of try to standardize that comparison across various different countries, various different currencies, and various different purchasing powers in different countries. So when the World Bank does this, and they consider a person to be in extreme poverty, they're considering that person to live on, it used to be standardized in 2011 prices at $1.90 per day. It's now gone up to $2.15. That doesn't matter too much. But again, the difficulty in measuring global poverty and making these types of comparisons is that price levels are very different in different countries. And so it's not sufficient to just convert the consumption levels of people in different countries by the market exchange rate. You also have to adjust for cross-country differences in purchasing power. Okay? So the poverty measurement that standardizes across these is trying to be based on a monetary value of a person's consumption. And again, it's going to try to adjust for purchasing power and price levels in various different conditions. Okay, so it's important to note that this extreme poverty is a very adequate term because this is a very, very low threshold. Okay, focusing on extreme poverty, though, is important because it can help us kind of capture, both the neediest in various different countries, but again, also to help us to make comparisons. Okay, so this is declining global poverty as a share of people living in extreme poverty, starting from 1820 and going forward to 2015. And as we see here, okay, we get some sharp declines in global extreme poverty, starting from 1950 and going forward. Okay? And I want to draw your attention to another portion. Can everyone see this part of the graph? Yeah. Okay, so according to this data, 44% of the total world population had lived in absolute poverty in 1981. So I know that 1981 sounds like a very long time ago to all of you, but that was the year I was born. Okay, so I am that old. But since 1981, okay, so since I've been alive, the share of poor people living in abject poverty in the world has declined incredibly fast. Okay, in fact, faster than ever before in world history. So in roughly 40 years, okay, I won't say exactly how many, you can do the math. In roughly 40 years, the share of people living in extreme poverty was divided by 4. Okay, so it reached by 2015. Okay, this sharp decline, it was reaching levels less than 10% of the world population. Okay, that's absolutely extraordinary. It's absolutely extraordinary, and I'll tell you what's even more extraordinary about what's happening over that time period. Is that just as the share of the world's population that's living in abject poverty is declining, the total world population is increasing. Okay? So, as we can see here by this measure, okay, roughly up until about 1970, you had the number of people living in abject poverty increasing as the world population was increasing. But starting around 1970, okay, you get an increase in the total world population at the same time as you're seeing a decline in the share of that total population living in abject poverty. Okay, so the chance of being born into poverty has declined dramatically over the last 200 years, and that decline in poverty at the same time of the rising total population is an absolute miracle. Okay. So according to estimates, there were roughly about 2.2 billion people living in extreme poverty in 1970, and there were roughly about 705 million people living in extreme poverty in 2015. Okay. So, what does that mean? If we were to think about it in terms of the way in which we think about the way that the media talks about growth and development to the extent that they ever do, to put that in perspective, in 1990, there were roughly 2 billion people living in extreme poverty. With a reduction of around 700 million in 2015, that would mean that on average, every single day since 1990, okay, so since even before you were born, okay, every single day, 137,000 fewer people were living in poverty. So imagine seeing news articles like this every single day, that economic growth, okay, is reduced. If it was literally coming on your screen every single day, for every day that you've been alive in 10 years beforehand, that captures that extreme steep decline. And yet when you ask people, in the last 30 years, the proportion of the world population is living in extreme poverty, many people don't actually know this. Okay? They think it's actually increased, or at least remain the same. And so, you know, it's important to kind of keep in mind the extreme, you know, improvement in kind of abject poverty that we've witnessed, even in just the recent past. So one important conclusion from the evidence presented is that if we're looking at abject poverty as measured by consumption, and it's been going down in the world for the last 2 centuries. But the question is, why do we care? And we care for a lot of reasons. Yeah?
We saw the aggregated global data about the declining share of population in extreme poverty. You have some data about where exactly in the world is it happening? Because I think it's driven mainly because of China and India economic growth.
Yeah.
If you have a more detailed data.
So I do, actually, I can show it to you afterwards because I actually took out that slide. I have data that parses it, taking out China and India. We see the same trajectory in the data. But certainly we're seeing a lot of the more recent steepness in that being driven by China. And I took out that slide, but it's a great question because it is important to look. And that's a point I'm going to turn to in just a second. But I want to underscore why we care about this. And I could show you a whole plethora of different slides about why it is that we should care, because income is correlated with all kinds of things that we really care about in terms of declines in infant mortality, increases in health, increases in well-being, okay, increases in education. All of these things are the type of things that people can begin to focus on when they're not dealing with abject poverty. Okay, so we'll push forward. I will say that I can show you a variety of different factors in which why we should care about increasing economic growth is good for poverty reduction, but it's also good because it's correlated with a lot of other measures. And those are all very compelling. But it's also important to recognize that it's also about how it is that people perceive their own life and life satisfaction. So I tend not to like to use happiness measures because I think those are misleading for a lot of reasons. But this is some data from Gallup that Gallup collected that asked people around their world what they thought about, are you satisfied or dissatisfied with your standard of living, all things considered, in terms of what you can buy and what you can do. And what this shows is it shows that it's reporting the share of people reporting to be dissatisfied with their standard of living and the total amount of GDP per capita in their country, okay? And what it seems to suggest is that as people live in countries where their GDP per capita is higher, okay, they tend to become more satisfied with the ability that their income allows them to buy and do, right? With the things that their income allows them to buy and do. Okay. So I put this forward because it suggests that economic prosperity is not a vain or unimportant goal for a means of bettering one's life, okay? There's really important measures of well-being that we can track with increases in the standard of living. But it's also the case that people themselves perceive their lives and their opportunities and their ability to kind of realize higher goals as something that comes with increasing increasing consumption possibilities. Okay. So we can also look at this in terms of GDP per capita versus self-reported life satisfaction. So higher national incomes tend to go together with higher average life satisfaction. Okay, so all of this is to suggest that I want to kind of dispel the idea that economic growth and increases in well-being should not be looked at as kind of a mere kind of casual as a casual or a materialistic perspective, but rather kind of from a fuller perspective of trying to realize one's life satisfaction. Okay, so what I've tried to establish for you so far is that economic growth is good, that higher levels of consumption are worth striving for, and we've witnessed an economic miracle in terms of this increasing economic growth that resulted from kind of widespread expansion of industrialization, specialization, and exchange. Okay, so that's what I've tried to tell you so far. Now, that's an optimistic and rosy picture. Despite making immense progress against extreme poverty, global poverty is still one of the most pressing problems that the world faces today. The world's poorest, there's a lot of variation in terms of income as it's between countries. And the poorest in the world are often undernourished. They're without access to basic things like electricity, drinking water, access to education, and they suffer from much poorer health. So some of the work of Nobel Prize-winning economist Angus Deaton looks at how it is that income per capita is correlated with the types of improvements in our well-being, such with our health. So it's vital that we understand what are the kind of factors and how do they contribute to economic growth. So again, this shows kind of a lot of the variation that still exists in terms of income across the globe. So the chart here shows the height of each bar representing the daily average income in a country, and the width of each country corresponds to the country's population size. Okay? And so they're ordered here by income from the poorest country on the very left to the richest country on the right. And so the reason why substantial economic growth is still necessary, it's because we still have a long ways to go for reducing global poverty and raising the average income in many countries across the world. Okay, so according to this kind of measure that's available in the world in our data, 82% of the world population still lives in countries where the mean income is less than $20 a day. Okay, so we've made incredible progress. We've moved from a world of make and take to a world of where trade is a possibility. And so we want to understand some of the factors which contribute to expanding that feasibility set to others across the globe. The first thing to note, and this is just a crude graph, it's standardized to 1990 data, is that there's different cases. There's growth miracles that we've experienced since the turn of the century in 1900. Japan, South Korea both stand out as examples here, but there's also growth disasters. Argentina, Nigeria are all cases of growth disasters. And so one thing that we might want to understand when we're thinking about economic growth is how it is that we measure and think about growth rates. Now, this is just kind of a simple calculation, but we can think about growth in any particular period, time t, as being the total GDP per capita in that time. So in time t minus the GDP per capita in t minus 1. Okay, and multiply that, divide that all over GDP per capita in year t minus 1, and multiply it times 100 to get a growth rate. Okay, so there we can compare growth rates between years and over time to understand and measure how GDP changes. Now, why is that important? Well, when we think about the magic of compounding, we usually think about the rule of 70. So the rule of 70 is used to determine the number of years it takes for a variable to double by dividing the number by 70 by the variable's growth rate. Okay, so the rule of 70 tells us the doubling time. And so the rule of 70 is generally used to determine how long it's going to take for an investment to double given the annual rate of return. Okay, so if real GDP per capita is growing at an annual growth rate of 3.5%, it's going to double in 20 years. What's the moral? Well, the moral of this story is that small improvements in growth can add up incredibly fast. The power of compounding is amazing. So let's look at this and think about it in more humanistic terms. Okay? What does this mean? Well, if we move from a world, if we're living in a world of zero annual economic growth, okay, we're never going to get out of a situation in which our incomes double over time. Okay? If we move into a world where we go from zero growth annually to 1% growth annually, it's going to take roughly 70 years to double your standard of living. Now, if you move from a world in which you're growing at an annual rate of 2% to an annual rate of 3%, we're talking about moving from 35 years to now income is going to double within a generation. Okay? So a difference in terms of a little bit of growth has huge monumental impacts for how it is that you can have changes in standard of living over a generation or so. Okay, so it really matters in terms of moving between growth rates of, say, 1% and 3%. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that there's actually two types of economic growth. There's catch-up growth and there's cutting-edge growth. So oftentimes, and part of the story in terms of the decline of poverty that we've seen over the last 20 years has been precisely the growth rates that have been experienced by countries like China and India. Okay? They've experienced very, very high growth rates over time. Well, these growth rates reflect what we call catch-up growth. Okay? Catch-up growth is growth that takes advantage of ideas, technologies, methods of management that are already in existence. Okay? It focuses on capital accumulation. It focuses on the combinatorial factors of production. And it leads us, and it's a situation in which countries that are falling behind in development can experience high rates of growth as they catch up by taking advantage of existing ideas, technology, and methods of production. Okay, the other kind of growth that we can examine is cutting-edge growth. So cutting-edge growth is the development of new ideas, focuses on developing new technologies for resources. Okay, so how much time do I have? Let's just say. So the important point for us is to think about these two different types of growth. Okay, we can think about immediate causes of growth that increases GDP per capita, and when we think about the type of catch-up growth that's possible, it's usually taking advantage of combining these factors of production. Combinations of physical capital, human capital, and technological knowledge such that we can get increases in our productive capacity. Okay? So those are immediate causes of increases in GDP, and those are incredibly important. They're incredibly important for countries that can experience this catch-up growth. But then there's also the ultimate causes. Okay? The causes that are the preconditions for countries to be able to take take advantage of combinatorial factors of production, of putting together their physical capital, human capital, and technological knowledge. And these are actually the fundamental institutions that create the incentives for entrepreneurs to be able to combine physical capital, human capital, and develop new technological knowledge. Okay. So I'll say a little something about those fundamental factors. When we think about those fundamental factors, we usually think about them in terms of the institutions that are necessary for economic growth. So I've put a list here together that kind of combines some of these. But the first thing to recognize about institutions is that they're multifaceted. They're multifaceted and they're multidimensional. This is an idea that comes from Douglas North. So when we're thinking about and diving into understanding the institutional prerequisites that give rise to the incentives for entrepreneurs to be able to combine their capital and human ingenuity, we have to recognize that can often be difficult or impossible to reduce them to kind of single measures without losing crucial aspects. So this idea was expanded on by another Nobel Prize-winning economist, Elinor Ostrom, who points out that the institutions that kind of provide for these rules of the game in society are often varied and multidimensional. They can be legal or extra-legal. They can be formal or informal. They can be centralized or decentralized, flexible, rigid, permanent, temporary, fragile, and robust. So all of these various different qualities, what I want to suggest is that there's a whole array of institutional possibilities that don't lend themselves to being understood or focused by single measures when we try to capture some of these institutional features. Okay, so the first, as we mentioned last class, is that private property rights are incredibly important. Property rights are going to provide the incentives for working productively, for encouraging investment and innovation. And when you don't have property rights, okay, effort is going to be divorced from reward. So the first kind of component to that is understanding the role of property rights. The second is that property rights are meaningless unless they're guaranteed. And this often comes with the backing of the state, but it need not always. Okay, so the important component for property rights is they have to have some significance in terms of providing the guarantee such that property rights can be acted on and actually influence productive incentives within an economy. So things like corruption can undermine kind of the strength of property rights because it bleeds resources away from productive entrepreneurs, but it also can take resources away from more productive kind of government activities. So when we look at like very crude correlations between corruption and growth, okay, so this is going from less corrupt countries to more corrupt countries and using standardized GDP measures from 2000, from 0 onwards. Okay, we see that there's a strong negative relationship between corruption and growth. Okay, political stability is incredibly important. Okay, so changing governments without the rule of law creates uncertainty, and uncertainty leads to less investment in physical and human capital. Okay, so we want to try to think about the types of institutions that create some certainty and expectations over time, and certainty and expectations over time that is also kind of combined with a strength of private property rights. Okay, this allows for entrepreneurs to be able to make the types of investments in physical and human capital that will reap rewards over time. Okay, so in many nations, you have civil wars, you have military dictatorships, you have anarchy that have destroyed the institutions that are necessary for economic growth. On top of that, you know, one of the key features that economic historians focus on when they're thinking about institutions is dependable legal systems. So you need good legal systems to facilitate contracts and protect property rights from others, including government. Okay, again, this is a part of the story about how it is that some of the kind of crucial institutional developments that facilitated the rise of the Industrial Revolution had to do with constraining the predatory nature of government and kind of reducing the scope in which they're able to kind of exact and extract from the population in which they control. And so poorly protected property rights can result from too much government or too little government. Okay? It's not just a one-dimensional measure. The other aspect is something that Adam Smith was keenly aware of. This notion that we, you know, in order to get societies to grow, you need what he calls a tolerable administration of justice. He puts it very simply. He makes it sound deceptively easy. He says, look, little else is requisite to carry a state to the highest degree of opulence from the lowest barbarianism, but peace, easy taxes, and a tolerable administration of justice. If it was only that easy, Adam Smith. But he does point out some very important factors about administration of justice. He points to it need not be perfect, but it need be tolerable. Okay? And justice, in Smith's view, is kind of a negative virtue. It's about the protection of persons, property, and contract. And that is kind of the features that Smith thought were incredibly important to getting the division of labor, specialization, and exchange off of the ground. Okay, so security of property provides this essential incentive for economic activity and economic growth. And as Smith pointed out at the time, economic growth matters most for the least well-off in society. So that's why the point of looking at the compounding nature of growth rates over time, these tend to matter for lifting the standards of the least well-off. So Smith made a very important claim later in the Wealth of Nations that in all other types of societies, the least well-off are going to be in the best position to further themselves in a growing economy, okay? Not one in which is stagnating. And so the last key kind of piece of that institutional puzzle is the importance of open markets and competition. And it's so important, in fact, that, you know, I will let Don Boudreau tell you all about it when he's going to talk about the importance of free trade as we go forward. But as many of these economists have looked at, this relationship between institutions, incentives, and the productive factors of the economy are so crucial that when we start thinking about them, it's really hard to turn your attention away from them. So I want to kind of end with kind of thinking about how these different institutions played a role in England's Industrial Revolution. So when we think about property rights, England's geography and its navy helped to protect its property rights early on. You had a long institutional development and history of the expansion and development of the rule of law that culminated very much in the growth of Parliament and religious changes that reduced the ability of royals and elites to engage in extractive activity amongst their population. You had political stability that came about as a rise of a middle class, a rise of the well-being of a large portion of the population. And you had the development of a dependable legal system, so less corruption as political power became constrained. And England opened itself up to more trade, to expand the scope of the market, to allow for division of labor, to allow for the productive capacities of its citizens to flourish. So with that, I will end, and we can discuss further. Thank you. Okay. Done.
So I just want to go back to something you said at the beginning with the death of Rothschild from bacteria.
Yeah.
It's even more recent than that. Less than 100 years ago, the healthy 16-year-old son, the President of the United States, in 1924, Calvin Coolidge Jr. was playing tennis on the White House lawn in July. Perfectly healthy 16-year-old boy. He got a blister on his toe. He died within a week because of lack of antibiotics. This is the President, this is the son of the President of the United States in the 20th century.
20th century,
there are people alive today who were alive then. That's how recent that particular blessing of modernity is.
Yeah, so when you start thinking about, just these comparisons in terms of well-being, like we were talking about the other day, they're multifaceted and they're exponential in terms of how much well-being has improved as a result of economic development. And so when you start thinking about it like that, it's hard not to kind of want to study and understand how it is that can expand to all of these other populations that have not experienced the same levels of economic growth that we have. Yeah.
You were saying that too much government control, political power is not good for the legal contracts and constraining the government. It's necessary. But where in the middle is the answer? You can have too much political power and too little political power, and the gap can be pretty high. And where is the right answer for freedom and economic growth?
So that's a good question. I encourage you all to study it and to look at it. And if you want to kind of think about it, I mean, it's not an easy issue. But there's, some work by an economist, Darren Acemoglu, has looked at this, and I kind of like some of the ways in which he approaches this question, because he's been thinking about how it is that some of these features how we might talk about them. And he talks about them in terms of inclusive institutions. So institutions that constrain the state enough to allow for economic activity to flourish, but do so in such a way that disperses political power more evenly across. So that's one of the reasons why we might find democratic institutions to be a favorable set of institutions for doing that. But he's careful to point out that those aren't the only institutions that might create kind of dispersions of power. But it's a famous kind of challenge that political scientists and political economists have looked at, and that the framers of the American Constitution wrestled with, in terms of it's a tricky business to try to first kind of empower the government to be able to do the things that we want it to do, but then also to constrain it in ways in which it won't actually exert the predatory capacities that it could use to predate on the people in which it's supposed to empower. And so, it's a very, very difficult question, but it's also a question that probably looks different in different contexts. And so I would point you to kind of thinking about the importance of various different ways in which political power can be constrained, but also dispersed. Yeah.
So I think that you did show that growth could be very important for people, and focusing on the latter part of the title, growth and poverty. I have like a line of thought, and I'll be glad to hear your perspective on how to distribute the wealth, because looking at both ends, some countries get very, very rich, and in these countries, some individuals, a very small percentage of individuals, get very, 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 very rich, holding a lot of wealth, in a place that I think that some of the advantages could plateau of that amount of wealth for well-being, etc. And on the other hand, looking at extreme poverty that you said is a very big problem of the world. So nowadays we have 8.5% of the population in extreme poverty. That's about 700 million people. So 700 million people times $2.15 a day times 365 days a year is about $500 billion, which is 0.5% of the global GDP. And that's if they make nothing. So if we'll give them $500 billion, or about half of it if they make something, that will be 10% of annual growth. So if we'll just take 10% of 1 year annual growth and give them to the poorest, we'll end extreme poverty this year. So this is of course very utopic and it can't actually happen, but how can and how should we distribute the wealth?
So let me take a cut at that in one particular way, in that I think one of the insights from economic growth is that transfers are not positive sum. It's just moving wealth from one place to another. And while that can, increases in aid can do something in terms of relieving, abject poverty, but they're not a recipe for economic growth over time. And so, believe me, there's a whole other lecture I could give on, the efforts of the IMF and the World Bank to be able to do these things over the last 20 years. And, in many cases, and in most cases, a lot of those efforts have simply just been transfers. They don't actually translate into economic growth. And one of the reasons for that is because this is an idea that comes from the classical political economist, is that there's an intricate relationship between the institutions that create the productive capacities in an economy and how that wealth is distributed, okay? So the connection between kind of the institutions that create the conditions under which you can actually combine the factors of production in order to realize economic growth are tied specifically to the ways in which that wealth is allocated in the country. So transfers are just going to be transfers. They're not going to create the conditions for growth. The second point to that is that I talked a little bit about catch-up growth and didn't talk a little bit about cutting-edge growth. Catch-up growth can be facilitated by kind of recombining the factors of production: human capital, physical capital, and technological ideas. But they're not going to create the growth that pushes the productive capacities forward. And those are going to be driven by two factors. One is increases in human capital. Increases in human capital, if you have a fixed population, will eventually experience diminishing returns as well, just like the returns to capital will. So you need new ideas. You need more people to have those new ideas. And you also need new ideas in terms of technological progress. And those are the two factors that we actually know that drive out cutting-edge growth. Okay, so the point being is that transfers might be a good Band-Aid. They might be able to alleviate some particular problems. They're not going to create the conditions for increasing returns. And so in order to get the conditions for increasing returns, we need to have some type of understanding about the relationship between institutions that will generate the productive capacities for cutting edge growth. So I think, yeah. Yes, Don.
So, in answer to that question, Bill Easterly, the great development economist, published a paper in 2003 in which he looked at the amount of foreign aid in inflation-adjusted dollars that went to countries in Africa, which is, of course, the continent most in need, allegedly most in need of it. And what he found is that as a percentage of foreign aid, as foreign aid as a percentage of GDP per country in Africa went up, economic growth went down.
Yeah.
So those countries that received less foreign aid grew more. Over time, as countries received more foreign aid, they grew less. So there seems to be a negative correlation. And of course, this is also found by Peter Bauer, a negative correlation between foreign aid and economic growth in poor countries.
There's a negative correlation, and in certain countries it's actually worse than
The
that.
economist, William Easterly.
What can
This
explain that?
correlational causation,
I'm sorry?
you can look at it over time. You can try to form causation. Because the correlation, it makes sense that foreign aid would go to the most needed countries, so it might be just a correlation.
You're
Unless
right,
you look at the
correlation is a causation, but he actually has a story that
What is the explanation of that?
I can give an example actually. When you give like malaria nets, when you donate malaria nets to African countries which deal with malaria, so it disrupts the local economy and they're not producing their own nets or their own aid. So we're kind of like creating a market failure, I guess, so they can't grow. So this is one specific example, I think.
the main explanation, Easterly gives several explanations. The main one he gives is that if money pours in from wealthier countries, the pressure on the ruling elites in those poor countries to reform their institutions to make the economy stronger are reduced.
So basically, the foreign aid can prop up governments that don't have to make investments in the institution and productive capacities of their country. And so to the extent that they can actually kind of rely on external aid, they're not going to make the investments in kind of creating the productive capacities, because there are the reason why you can have a stationary bandit is if the bandit can actually tax their country and receive rents from that. There's a delicate balance there, but he very much points to this ability of countries and elites to be able to use that foreign aid, not to invest into their country, but to basically subsidize their own consumption.
Just to connect to Don's point, there's an African entrepreneur, a young woman who's an activist, who tries to tell countries in the world, stop sending us money and stuff, let us make it here and create a market and have economic growth from within. So that's her activism. For years now.
The discussion is not about transfers, it's about investing. Like if you will establish a Brown Center in Rwanda, it's not a transfer, but you can believe that more 20-25 years, the society, the capital human there increase, and maybe the economic growth. So it's not transfer like I send you money and they can do it the what you want. It's more like to increase the capital human there.
So this was another argument that was very popular with the World Bank and with development agencies that also Bill Easterly's work tries to debunk. And what they tried to say is, okay, well, you have these poor countries that are experiencing this capital financing gap. What is the gap between what they need to invest and what they actually have? And if we use foreign aid to fill that financing gap, we would expect that they're going to funnel that into creating the productive capacity within their own country. This is a great idea, right? It just turns out it doesn't work that way. So Bill Easterly has a lot of accounts that countries that did that, their foreign aid goes up, but their productive capacity in these investments don't actually take hold. So one reason for it is you can have corrupt governments. Another reason for it is that you actually don't have those institutional precursors that allow for these countries to actually reap the rewards of the capital investments that they have. So the financing gap isn't just a lack of money. It's a lack of the fundamental institutions that create the conditions under which that investment's going to be profitable in the first place. So sometimes it's corruption, but sometimes it's exposing this kind of fundamental mismatch between the institutions and the investment opportunities. Yes?
If it was to immigrate or to move the capital human there, not only the institute. If you take like a 15 lecture from Brown and found them there, and also build like new building and bring the high or the innovative the content from the academics. Maybe more 15, 20 years, you can see growth there.
Well, see, one of the reverse problems of that is, countries that lack these kind of institutions for productive entrepreneurship experience brain drain. To the extent that people can immigrate, they're going to take their human capital with them to places in which they can be more productive, and that's all the better for the individuals and for the countries that can take those people in. And so, it's often the case that the incoming immigrants are bringing with them a whole host of human capital that they can't exploit and take full advantage of in places where there aren't those prerequisite institutions to somewhere where they can, and they're far more productive and wealthy as a result of it. So it's it works both ways. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Russia is a good example. I'm Greek myself, but my mother came from Russia in the 90s, and she was a doctor, and there was a lot of drainage from Russia because, there was this stagnation, and you studied so hard, you worked hard, but your living standard was still very low. And we see the state Russia is in now, and its institutions I think are very bad. And because a lot of people, they came to Israel, they went to the USA, they came to Europe, and there's nothing left. This is how I see it.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good example in terms of, to the extent that people are able to leave those places and seek better opportunities. Again, it's better for the individual, but it's also better for the countries that are able to accept those immigrants in. Because, right, as we were talking about in terms of cutting edge growth, one of the factors necessary for that is to have the human capital and the new ideas that can generate that cutting edge growth that we care about. So, yeah.
Two questions. First one is regarding creative destruction aspect of growth. Specifically, I would be interested, as a professor in Brown, how the university preparing for ChatGPT and by students, which is obviously will be more prevalent in humanities, etc. So I'll be happy to hear about that. And another point is we see countries like Chile, which enjoyed great economic growth, but now they're electing the leaders that want to roll back all kinds of policies that help the growth. The society is revolting. So I think it's also connected somewhat to the first question, but if you could comment on those two.
Yeah, in terms of the creative destruction point, I think one of the things that's incredibly important to keep in mind is that creative destruction does destroy kind of older ways of doing things in ways that hopefully are more productive, and that does incur short-term readjustment costs. Losses, those are real costs to people who have invested in those earlier skill sets and those earlier technologies. But it's important to always keep in mind that with new technologies, there's kind of two different effects. There's a substitution effect, right? There's GTP can do things for me that I used to have to do myself. So it'll substitute away from some of those things. But there's also the complementary effect. Okay, new technologies can complement different skills and different skill sets in various different ways. And so to the extent that we worry about ChatGTP like ruining my students' ability to write essays, that might be one outcome of this new development, but it may also be that ChatGTP can provide all kinds of substitute or complementary, can complement existing and new skill sets in new and more productive ways. So let me give you an example. With ChatGTP, I've seen, I've run a couple of examples myself. It makes some very humorous poems. It can write some kind of nice summaries. In terms of actually answering questions in terms of my exams, it's not great. But it will probably get better. However, if you put into ChatGTP a whole kind of audio transcript of something, perhaps this lecture today, you put it into ChatGTP, and it can provide editing functions to smooth out all of my ums and ahs and times when I've repeated myself, and it can kind of provide this function of editing a transcript in a way that could be a complement to actually not substituting for my lecture, but actually making it more productive in terms of the ways in which it's disseminated down the line. And so that's a way in which the technology, it's indeterminate at this point exactly how and in what ways that new technology is going to substitute for old ways of doing things, and hence, make those old ways obsolete. But there's many different ways in which those new technologies can actually complement existing skill sets and new skill sets in ways that are more productive going forward. So it's always important to kind of keep in mind that new technologies can have both effects. And certainly it's not always ex ante clear which effect is going to dominate for what types of skills. So that's kind of something to keep in mind whenever we're thinking about creative destruction and new technologies coming online.
Regarding the Chile comment.
And the Chile comment was?
Yeah, so Chile enjoyed great economic growth, much more than other South American countries, but now society there is voting for a government that is rolling back many of the reforms that helped the growth, and in general they seem unhappy, although they enjoyed great economic growth much more than their neighbors.
Yeah.
Just like, why do you think this is happening, and what can help change it?
So it's a complicated issue. The simplest answer that I'll give there is that one of the kind of things that we think we know about this relationship between political and economic institutions is that they're inextricably intertwined. Okay, so to the extent that you get the development of inclusive political institutions, they tend to create more stability over time by both distributing power and kind of making access to these types of institutions more inclusive. So one kind of thing that could be going on is that there's a reaction to the ways in which that kind of constitutional moment in Chile was implemented, in terms of not actually creating the sets of institutions where the people on the ground felt that they were inclusive. Now, I don't know if that's the case. That's one hypothesis. But it's certainly, does seem to be some disconnect in terms of the ways in which people perceived those constitutional reforms as being legitimate or not legitimate. And that's a very big problem in terms of the development of institutions. They're not some, Bob and I were talking about this over dinner the other night. Institutions, the insight from Hayek is that oftentimes these things can't be constructed from the top down. It's not to say that those efforts are always futile, But many types of robust and stable institutions are a result of a process that over time evolves and is more inclusive in the ways in which it starts to kind of get buy-in from the populations that live underneath those institutions. And so that's the best that I can do with a very, very difficult question.
Yeah, I think it's exactly also, we can see this also in Israel now, that a lot of the discussion about the judicial reforms has to do with like parts of society not feeling represented in the high court, and whether you're on the left or the right, it's a problem that needs to be addressed, and probably that's the root of what's going on now. So, and I think it has to do also with what's going on here right now. So, yeah.
Just commenting about Chile, the growth in Chile is started with reforms that were imposed by a military dictatorship, Pinochet, and also it's the part of a big leftist wave in all of South America, not only in Chile. And the GDP per capita in Chile is very similar to that of in Uruguay, for example. We don't see the illegitimacy of the right policy in Uruguay, but
yes,
it's much less fluctuation in left.
So just to be clear, the reforms that were implemented in Chile were extremely important in terms of unleashing markets and market forces and producing an increase in economic well-being for them. So the reforms themselves were quite good. But I think that it's important to keep that in mind versus how those kind of changes in institutions are able to stick with the population. And I think that's a challenge that I was addressing in terms of my comments about the reform measures.
Can you give an example for a bottom-up institution?
I mean, one of the classic examples that Hayek likes to talk about is the development of common law. The development of common law over time is not something that comes from the top down, but rather is a development that happens as a result of people having disagreements about bringing those disagreements to a court, having those disagreements resolved, and precedent developing over time based not on some kind of constructed idea from above, but rather as a development of sorting out similar problems over a variety of different instances, such that we develop a norm, a rule, a custom, a practice that is reflective of people's actual considerations on the ground. And so one of the reasons why Hayek's very fond of a common law style system is precisely because it has some of these properties of developing from kind of common people's experiences in terms of trying to resolve how do we think about property rights in this context? How do we think about property rights in this context? And precedent developing that actually reflects the way that people use real resources and engage in practices on the ground. So that would be, I think, one of the kind of key examples of how it is that you get these evolutionary rules operating.
I was wondering, what are the factors taken into consideration in order to create the graph that you show the countries with high well-being or countries with satisfied civilians? Is it like the happiness index? The Danish people are the happiest people in the world?
No, so thanks for asking about that. I purposefully don't like to rely on the happiness measures precisely because I think they're fraught for a number of different reasons. I think people's conceptions of what constitutes happiness are very, very different. It's also the case that people's idea about a life well lived doesn't necessarily always involve a happy life, right? There's many things that are worth, doing in life that don't generate happiness. And so, that's why I tend to look at this particular measure. And this is a measure. So this is, dissatisfaction with, so the question that the Gallup poll asks is, are you satisfied or dissatisfied with your standard of living of all the things that you can buy and do? So I look at this as a reflection of this notion of, well, I tend to be much more satisfied with all of the things that I can do when I live in a country that has a higher per capita GDP. We also look at other measures. So this one is GDP per capita versus self-reported life satisfaction. And so here, this is an index that they create based on, it's a 0 to 10 index. And it's, I'm sorry? The satisfaction is subjectively determined on the part of the respondent. So it's trying to avoid this notion of imparting someone else's view about what a satisfied life is onto the questionnaire. Now, it's not perfect, but again, I like to kind of look at these types of measures as opposed to happiness measures because it's up to the individual to determine what constitutes satisfaction versus what you think you might, how you might respond when you talk about happiness. I think that's a fraught measure. It's not perfect, but it does have the advantage of trying to kind of look at things from the individual's own perspective and understanding about what satisfaction means to them. All right. Well, thank you.